The first time I learned that money can erase a landscape. I was 12 and standing in knee-high brackish water with a basket of glass eels. The marsh behind our stilt house had been a nursery for fish longer than anyone could remember. But that spring, the reeds turned brown, and the mud smelled like copper. A week later, the men from the district office arrived with crisp boots and a laminated map. They said an innovative flood mitigation corridor would be built, and that our mangrove patch would be cleared for safety. My aunt spat into the water and asked who had decided that safety meant cutting roots. The official smiled and said a donor had called. One phone call, and the machines came. Trees that had held the shoreline together fell like they were guilty. That night, my grandfather, Old Bin, sat under a kerosene lamp and wrote a number in his battered ledger. Not just the cost of trees, but the cost of crabs we would no longer catch, the cost of soil that would drift away, the cost of years our village would spend relearning how to live with the water. He told me, "Nell, if they take your ground, they owe you more than an apology. Apologies are cheap. Repair is not." I didn't understand then that he was teaching me the only math that matters. Debt is real, even when the rich pretend it's abstract. By 19, I was still in the same delta, still smelling salt on my wrists. But my world had expanded to include a cracked laptop, a scholarship brochure, and a yellow dog named Puddle who followed me like a second shadow. Puddle was not elegant. He had one ear that refused to stand up, and a habit of stealing shrimp heads. He was also loyal in the way that makes you feel guilty for ever doubting anything. When my mother died, sudden stroke, no warning. 1 minute scolding me for oversalting soup, and the next minute gone. People brought rice and incense and phrases that sounded like rocks. Be strong. She's in a better place. Life goes on. I nodded through it all, and did what my grandfather had taught me. I tallied. My mother's hospital bill. The year of school fees she'd been saving for. The mangrove corridor that had never been completed, but had still gutted our shoreline. The promises that had drifted away like foam. I didn't yet know that my name, Nella Tran, was attached to a different ledger somewhere else. One that was kept in climate-controlled air and bound in leather. He found me on a Friday when the rain made the river look like hammered metal. A black vehicle stopped on the dirt lane beside our fish-drying racks, so clean it looked offended by mud. A man stepped out wearing a gray coat and a face built from polite angles. He introduced himself as Mr. Soren Vale, legal counsel for Marilon Holdings. The name meant nothing to me. He held out a sealed envelope and said, "Miss Tran, we have reason to believe you are entitled to a personal trust established under the Marilon family charter." My grandfather's hand tightened around his cane. "We have reason to believe," he echoed, voice thin. "You speak like a weather report, Mr." Vale smiled as if he'd been trained to treat suspicion as a compliment. "There was an administrative anomaly," he said. "A record discrepancy at birth." He glanced at me, then at Puddle, who had decided the newcomer's shoes were interesting. "Your biological father is Mr. Adrian Marilon." I waited for laughter. None came. The rain kept tapping the vehicle roof. My chest felt hollow, not with awe but with irritation. "And?" I asked. Mr. Vale blinked. He hadn't expected that. "And the family wishes to rectify the situation," he said. "Your presence is requested at the Marilon estate in Harbor City." My grandfather barked a laugh. "Requested," he said, "like a shipment." "Mr." Vale ignored him and added, "There are conditions." Of course there were. Rich people never give anything without footnotes. On the drive to Harbor City, Mr. Vale recited rules as if he were reading safety instructions on an airplane. First, I was not to publicize my connection to Marilon Holdings until a structured announcement could be arranged. Second, I was not to remove or publicly confront the current Marilon heiress, Leora Marilon, who had been raised as the founder's granddaughter. Third, I was not to compete for affection within the household. I stared out at rain-blurred rice fields and asked, "What does that even mean?" Mr. Vale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It means you should avoid unnecessary conflict," he said. "We want a smooth integration." Smooth for whom? I wondered. Puddle snored softly at my feet, unaware he was crossing a social border that would not welcome his fur. My grandfather, who had insisted on coming despite his knees, sat beside me in the back seat and whispered, "Remember the ledger." I nodded. I wasn't going to Harbor City to beg for belonging. I was going to collect what had been stolen from our river by a single phone call and a pair of high heels. Harbor City looked like someone had taken glass and ambition and stacked them toward the sky. The Marilon estate sat behind a gate so tall it felt like a moral statement. Inside, the driveway was lined with ornamental trees that had never been asked to feed anyone. When we entered the main hall, a woman in pearl earrings turned toward us with eyes already wet, as if tears were part of her jewelry. "My darling Leo," she was saying to a young woman on a velvet sofa, "you will always be my only daughter." The young woman Leora clung to her like a photogenic tragedy. A tall young man stood nearby, jaw set, radiating the kind of protective arrogance that comes from never being corrected. His gaze flicked to me as if I were a stain on the marble. "Mr." Vale cleared his throat and announced my arrival like a package delivery. Before anyone could speak, Puddle trotted in, nails clicking, and shook rainwater onto the rug. The pearl woman's face tightened. "What is that?" she snapped. "A dog," I said, because I refused to pretend it was a metaphor. The young man's lip curled. "This is not a farm," he said. "Take it outside." I crouched and scratched Puddle behind the ear. "He stays," I said. "We were told my conditions would be respected." "Mr." Vale's smile twitched. The pearl woman looked at him as if he were incompetent. The young woman on the sofa sniffed and said in a small voice, "Sister, do you hate me?" Her performance was so practiced that I almost admired the rehearsal time. My grandfather made a small sound of disgust. I straightened and said, calmly, "I don't have enough time to hate strangers. I'm here to talk about repayment." The room froze, as if I had spoken a language they'd forgotten existed. The patriarch entered then, not with a cane like my grandfather, but with a silence that made people rearrange their faces. Adrian Marilon was older than I'd pictured, hair silver, posture rigid, eyes calculating. He looked at me as if measuring whether I could be folded into his narrative without wrinkles. "Nella," he said, as if tasting the syllables. "You've come." I waited for warmth. It didn't arrive. He gestured toward a chair. I did not sit. "We have welcomed you." The pearl woman, Vivian said, voice sharpened by entitlement. "You should be grateful." My grandfather laughed out loud, a rasping bark that made servants flinch. "Grateful for what?" he said. "For being summoned after 19 years? Adrian's eyes narrowed. "We will discuss history later," he said. "For now, you will follow the rules you were given." I tilted my head. "Which rule says I can't talk about money?" I asked. The tall young man stepped forward. "We are family," he said. "You don't invoice family." I looked at him. "Family doesn't bulldoze mangroves for a dirty shoe," I said. That was the first time Vivian's composure cracked. Her eyes flared. "How dare you speak like that?" she hissed. "You've brought your village manners into my home." I smiled without kindness. "This is not your home," I said. "It's a corporation's showroom." I reached into my bag and pulled out my grandfather's ledger, the pages thick with years of ink. I placed it on the coffee table like a judge's gavel. "Let's begin with the Marsh." They stared at the ledger as if it might stain the furniture. Leora's tears paused in confusion, which told me she hadn't practiced for this scene. Adrian's gaze flicked to the numbers and then away, as if looking at debt gave it legitimacy. "What is this?" he asked. My grandfather answered for me. "A calculation," he said. "Your fake daughter, ordered a clearing in the Longleaf Marsh when she was 16 because oranges from our trees fell on her shoes at a charity tour." A phone call, a bulldozer, 100 families lost fish stock for years. Vivian's mouth opened. "Leo would never," she began, but her voice wavered. Leora, recovering, pressed a hand to her chest. "I didn't mean it," she said. "I was young. I was impulsive. I'm sorry." The tall young man, Kieran, I learned from later whispers, wrapped an arm around her shoulders and glared at me. "She apologized," he said. "That should be enough." I tapped the ledger. "Apologies don't replant roots," I said. "This does." I slid a printed assessment across the table. Photos, yield projections, shoreline erosion estimates, opportunity cost. Old Bin had kept records for decades. I had digitized them into models at the university library when I could borrow a computer. At the bottom was a number so large, Vivian inhaled sharply. "This is extortion," she spat. I shook my head. "It's restitution," I said. "And it's cheaper than the lawsuit you'll face if the commission audits your corridor contracts." Adrian's eyes sharpened. That got his attention. Rich men only respect threats that sound like paperwork. For a moment, the house was quiet except for Puddle's sigh. Adrian finally spoke. You want compensation, he said. Fine. We can discuss a settlement. Vivian's face contorted. Adrian, she whispered, horrified at the idea of paying a rural girl. Kieran scoffed. She's trying to squeeze us, he said. Leora dabbed her eyes and said softly, If paying helps the village, then I accept the blame. It was a beautiful line. I could almost hear the cameras. I didn't argue. I simply said, Good. Then you won't mind putting that in writing. Leora froze. Adrian's mouth tightened. We will handle it privately, he said. I smiled. No, I said. You'll handle it in a way that can't be reversed when your stock price wobbles. That's the difference between charity and repair. I turned the page of the ledger and pointed to a section labeled Future Loss. This is 10 years of fisheries impact, I said. This is the school roof we couldn't fix. This is the clinic we couldn't staff. You don't get to call that history. It's our present. Kieran's face reddened. You don't belong here, he snapped. You can't just walk into a house like this and demand. I can, I interrupted, because you already demanded from us. The words landed, and for the first time Adrian's gaze lingered on me with something like interest. Not affection, never that, but recognition of a negotiator. They didn't pay that day. They postponed, deflected, offered education opportunities, and a stipend, and a career pathway. I declined each one. I wasn't interested in being purchased as a story of generosity. I wanted the marsh restored. I wanted the village compensated. And I wanted Leora's performance to stop being rewarded by everyone's fear of discomfort. The compromise Adrian offered was strategic. He enrolled me in Harbor City International Academy, the same school Leora attended, under a special program, and claimed it would help me adapt. I recognized the maneuver. Put me in a world designed to make me feel small, hoping shame would replace my insistence. They underestimated two things: my grandfather's ledger and my own appetite for quiet revenge. I accepted the school transfer because it gave me access to resources, networks, and, most importantly, a stage where evidence could become louder than pedigree. On my first day at the academy, I wore rubber sandals and a canvas bag that read, "We fix what we break" in faded letters. Puddle trotted beside me until the security guard stopped us, frowning. "Animals aren't allowed inside," he said. I crouched, kissed Puddle's head, and left him at the gatehouse with a bowl of water. The guard, despite himself, smiled and scratched Puddle behind the ear. Inside, the school looked like a museum funded by guilt. Students watched me with the hungry curiosity of people who had never been required to imagine other lives. Leora's orbit formed quickly. A ring of girls with expensive hair, led by a sharp-faced one named Rhea Shin. They whispered loud enough for me to hear at least the parts my ears didn't miss in the echoing hallway. "That's the Marsh girl," Rhea said, "the one trying to blackmail Marilyn." Leora appeared beside her with a gentle smile. "Don't be mean," she murmured, as if kindness were a brand she wore. Then she looked at me and asked, eyes shimmering, "Do you want to be friends?" It was an offer designed to trap me. Accept and become subordinate. Refuse and be labeled hostile. I chose a third option. "I want to be left alone," I said pleasantly, and walked to class. They tested me for weeks with petty humiliations. Spilled milk on my notes, accidental bumps in hallways, a group project scheduled without telling me. I didn't react. The Marsh teaches patience. I simply documented. Dates, witnesses, screenshots. I kept a folder called Salt Ledger on my laptop, filling it with small proofs the way my grandfather filled his paper ledger with yields. When Rhea snatched my bag and mocked the slogan, I smiled and said, "Careful, that ink stains." She laughed. She had no idea evidence is its own kind of stain. Leora remained publicly kind, privately absent, letting her satellites do the dirty work while she preserved innocence. It was a clever structure. It was also predictable. Midterm season arrived with an all-grade diagnostic exam, the kind the academy treated like a blood sport. Rumors spread that I would fail, because rural kids must be ignorant, because poverty is assumed to be incompetence. I took the exam and finished early. I put my head down and napped because I'd been waking before dawn to call my grandfather and talk through restoration plans for the marsh. When scores posted, the hallway filled with the usual shrieks. Then the noise shifted into a stunned hush. My name, Nellatran, sat at the top with a score that made the second-ranked student look mediocre. Rhea's mouth hung open. Leora stared as if the numbers had insulted her personally. Teachers began using my work as an example. Suddenly, my village manners were rebranded as refreshing authenticity. That was how quickly the rich change language when it benefits them. I didn't enjoy the attention. I used it. Attention is currency in a place where cash is already abundant. The Academy announced its annual Blue Horizon Challenge, a competition where teams designed sustainability proposals for real corporate partners. The winner would be invited to present at the Harbor City Climate Summit, a televised event where reputations were minted. Leora wanted to win. She needed it. The Marilyn scandal had bruised her image, and she needed a new narrative. The philanthropist heiress saving the world. Teams were paired by lottery, but the lottery was, conveniently, adjusted by administrators. Leora appeared at my desk one afternoon with her gentle smile. "Let's partner," she said. "You're good with numbers. I'm good at presenting. Together we'll win, and then we can use the prize money to help your village." The offer was syrupy. It also reeked of a trap. She wanted my ideas, my data, my Marsh model, packaged in her velvet voice. I considered refusing. Then I thought of the summit cameras, the corporate panel, and the fact that evidence is most effective when it's displayed to people who can't pretend not to see it. "Okay," I said. "Let's partner." Leora's eyes flashed with triumph for a fraction of a second, then smoothed back into kindness. Rhea smiled behind her like a blade. Preparation happened in the Academy's Innovation Lab, a room full of sleek machines and moral slogans. I brought my marsh restoration framework, a cycle of mangrove replanting, oyster reef seeding, community-managed fish nurseries, and microgrid power for pumps methods built from our delta's reality, not from donor fantasies. Leora nodded, took notes, praised my local perspective. She insisted on holding all files on her personal tablet for convenience. I refused. I created encrypted versions and shared them through the school's secure server. Rhea complained that I was paranoid. I smiled and said, "Paranoia is just pattern recognition in a place that punishes trust." Leora laughed lightly, as if it were a joke. I didn't laugh. I placed a small recording tag inside my pen cap, not because I love drama, but because my grandfather's ledger had taught me that memory is not enough when money is involved. The day before our prototype submission, Leora announced she felt faint and needed to visit the nurse. She left me in the lab with Rhea to help. Rhea hovered by the workstation, asking me to check a calibration line, trying to pull my attention away. Behind me, I heard a soft click USB, port, transfer. I didn't turn. I simply kept mixing my sample solution and let the pen do its quiet work. When I finished, I checked the server logs. A file access spike. A download from Leora's account at 2:11 a.m. The pattern was classic. Steal, then blame. The next morning, administrators called us in. Leora sat with reddened eyes. "Something terrible happened," she whispered. "Our project files are corrupted. I think Nella may have moved them without telling me." Rhea chimed in, faux sympathetic. "She's not used to systems like ours," she said. "Maybe she clicked the wrong thing." The advisor sighed. "Without the core dataset, your team may be disqualified," he said. Leora gasped like a saint. "No," she pleaded. "It's my fault." I pushed her too hard. "Please don't punish her. Her performance was perfect, designed to earn pity while letting me carry the stain." I watched it with calm disgust. I didn't reveal anything yet. A disqualification would hurt, but a public exposure at the summit would hurt them more. Our team was disqualified. The Academy mourned Leora's unfair setback. Teachers shook their heads at my carelessness. I went back to my room, fed Puddle shrimp heads, and listened to the recording. Rhea's voice. "Are you sure the camera angle doesn't catch it?" Leora's voice, sweet and sharp beneath. "Relax. She's Delta trash. Nobody will believe her. Just copy the dataset, and I'll present a cleaned version with better graphics. If she complains, we'll say she's jealous and unstable." Then she laughed, and the laugh sounded like someone stepping on reeds. I saved the file in 3 places: my laptop, an encrypted cloud folder, and a drive I mailed to my grandfather in a package labeled dried fish. Redundancy is how you survive rich people. 2 weeks later, the Harbor City Climate Summit began, and Marilyn Holdings sponsored the main stage. The irony could have been art if it weren't lethal. Adrian sat in the front row, Vivian beside him, pearls gleaming. Kieran stood near the aisle, scanning the room like a guard dog. Leora, in a white suit, walked onto stage to applause. A banner behind her read, Marilyn Future, Repair and Resilience. She began her presentation smoothly, describing a community-centered Delta restoration model with slides that matched my work line for line, except she had replaced our village names with generic terms and removed any mention of the Marsh clearing incident. The audience murmured approval. Cameras loved her. I sat near the back with Puddle sleeping under my chair because security had tried to stop him, and the guard at the door had shrugged and said, "Let the dog in." Sometimes small mercy arrives from unexpected places. As Leora reached her closing, Adrian stood, ready to praise his daughter. He lifted a microphone and said, "My family has always believed in stewardship. We have never harmed the Delta, only helped it." The room applauded. That sentence was a lie, but it wasn't the one I needed. The one I needed was Leora's. She smiled, hand on her heart, and said, "I swear my proposal is original, ethically sourced, and built from my own research. I swear I would never profit from another person's hardship." The word swear landed under the bright stage lights like a thrown gauntlet. She had chosen it for drama, for sincerity points. She had no idea how dangerous sincerity can be when you have evidence. I walked down the aisle. Ushers tried to stop me, but the cameras were already swinging. Interruption is always good television. I stepped onto the side stairs and faced the stage. Leora's smile faltered. Vivian's face tightened. Adrian's eyes narrowed, calculating damage control. I took the microphone from the spare stand, not snatching, simply taking, as if I belonged there, because confidence is a language the powerful understand. "Hello," I said. My voice was steady. "My name is Nella Tran. I'm from Longleaf Delta." A ripple ran through the audience. Some recognized the name from scandal threads. Leora's eyes glittered with warning. "Sister," she whispered into her mic, sweetness sharpened. "Please don't do this here." I looked at her and smiled. "You asked the sky to witness you," I said. "I'm just bringing the receipts." I nodded to the tech booth and handed them my USB. "Play track 1. I said. The audio filled the hall. Ria's anxious question, Leora's cruel confidence, the click of a file transfer. The audience's gasp was physical. Leora froze, as if the sound had pinned her. Then her knees buckled slightly. Cameras zoomed. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a thin breath. Vivian surged to her feet, shouting, "This is fabricated." Kieran moved toward me, rage in his face. But security intercepted him because a fight on camera is a liability. Adrian's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He had built an empire on controlling narratives. A narrative had just bitten him on live broadcast. I didn't stop at the recording. While Leora shook on stage, I clicked to the next slide. The server logs showing her 2 to 11 a.m. download, then the Marsh photos, then my grandfather's ledger scan with the mangrove loss calculation. The room shifted from shock to hunger. Journalists smelled a story bigger than plagiarism. They smelled corporate hypocrisy. I kept my tone calm. "This proposal," I said, pointing to Leora's slides, "was built from my village's data and my grandfather's records. Records kept while your family's contractors bulldozed our shoreline because an heiress's shoes were dirty. You can call that impulsive. You can call it youthful. We call it theft." Leora's eyes overflowed. She whispered, "I didn't mean..." I cut her off gently. "Meaning doesn't replant roots," I said. "Repair does." I turned toward Adrian. "You asked what I wanted," I said. "Here it is. Restitution paid to Longleaf Delta, plus a binding investment in restoration infrastructure managed by our cooperative, not by your PR team. A public apology that includes the truth, not a poem. And the end of any corridor contract that hides profit inside disaster mitigation." The room was silent, except for camera shutters. Adrian stared at me as if deciding whether to crush me or buy me. Then he did what powerful men do when cornered on record. He negotiated. Adrian stepped to the microphone and said, carefully, "We will conduct an independent review." Boos rose from the audience. People were tired of reviews. I raised my hand. "Independent review is not payment," I said. Adrian's jaw tightened. "We will fund restoration," he said, "in partnership with the state." I shook my head. "In partnership with the people whose mud you turned into a balance sheet," I said. Vivian shouted that I was ungrateful, that Marilyn had given me education opportunities, that family was family. I looked at her and said, Family is not a shield against accountability. Kieran tried to speak, but his words tangled. Leora began to cry openly, mascara sliding, and for the first time, her tears looked less like performance and more like fear. Not regret, fear of losing status. That was fine. Fear is an honest emotion, even when it's ugly. Adrian finally said, "Name your figure." I named it, using my grandfather's ledger numbers, plus inflation, plus ecological restoration costs, calculated by independent experts. The number made Vivian gasp as if she'd been slapped. The audience, however, murmured approval, because the number sounded less like greed and more like consequence when you showed the math. Adrian's face went pale, then he nodded once, a micro-movement that meant yes in the language of profit. "We will pay," he said. The hall erupted, half cheering, half jeering. I stepped back from the mic, heart hammering, not triumphant, just exhausted. Puddle lifted his head and wagged his tail, unaware he'd witnessed a ledger being cashed. The days after the summit were chaos. Marilyn stock dipped, hashtags trended, politicians demanded hearings. Leora was flown out of the country for her mental health, which was a euphemism for hiding a scandal behind ocean distance. Vivian tried to sue me for defamation until her lawyer explained that suing a whistleblower with recordings was like punching a hornet's nest. Kieran sent me a message that said, "You ruined our family." I replied with one sentence, "Your family ruined a coastline." Adrian's team moved fast to contain damage by turning it into a redemption arc. They drafted agreements, proposed glossy documentaries about healing the Delta, offered me an ambassador role. I refused the role. I accepted the money only through a structure that prevented Marilyn from rerouting it later. A trust governed by our cooperative, audited publicly, with spending tied to restoration milestones. Adrian gritted his teeth but signed. He didn't do it out of conscience. He did it because cameras had made his world smaller. That's how leverage works. Back in Longleaf Delta, the transfer hit our cooperative account like a thunderclap. People gathered at the community hall, staring at the bank screen as if it might dissolve into a joke. Old Bin sat in the front row, ledger on his lap, hands shaking. He didn't cry. He simply flipped to the page where he had first written the mangrove debt and drew a single line through it. Slow and deliberate. "Paid," he said quietly. The word was heavy. We didn't waste time. We hired local crews. We ordered mangrove seedlings. We contracted marine biologists and trained teenagers to monitor salinity. We rebuilt the clinic roof. We installed a microgrid. Puddle ran through the mud like a king. People laughed more that month than they had in years. And still, I didn't feel like a princess. I felt like a debt collector who had finally forced the world to acknowledge that rural suffering is not invisible. A year later, the Longleaf Delta looked different. Not healed, healing is slow but alive. Young mangroves held onto silt. Oyster reefs started filtering water. Fish returned in cautious numbers, like neighbors testing whether it was safe to come back. The Restoration Center, a glass and bamboo building designed to breathe with the humidity, displayed my grandfather's ledger in a case at the entrance. Tourists came, taking photos, calling it inspirational. I didn't mind the attention anymore because attention now paid for maintenance. One afternoon, I received a letter from Adrian Marilyn. Not an email paper, heavy, formal. He wrote that Marilyn Holdings was restructuring, that donors were pressuring him to do the right thing. He offered me a seat on the corporate board. It was a bribe disguised as recognition, a chance to turn me into proof that the system was fair. I read the letter twice, then burned it under the mango tree behind our stilt house. I didn't want a seat at their table. I wanted them to stop building tables on stolen ground. People asked me if I hated Leora. I thought of her crying on stage, of the way she used softness as armor, of the way she had learned that being fragile makes others hesitate to hold you accountable. I didn't hate her. Hate is too intimate. I saw her as a symptom of a family that trained children to treat the world like a prop. If she ever came to the Delta and apologized without cameras, I would listen. Not because forgiveness is obligatory, but because repair sometimes begins when the person who caused harm finally understands the texture of what they damaged. Until then, my focus stayed on roots and budgets and the stubborn labor of making land stable again. My grandfather's ledger remained open, not for revenge but for clarity. Every time a new grant arrived, every time a new contractor bid on work, we wrote it down. Transparency is a kind of fence. It doesn't keep everyone out, but it keeps people from pretending they never crossed. What the cameras didn't show was how a promise turns into paperwork, and how paperwork tries to crawl back into the shadows when the spotlight moves on. Marilyn's lawyers drafted the restoration trust with language that looked generous until you read the verbs. May, endeavor, in good faith. Words designed to slip. I sat with our cooperative committee, fishers, teachers, 2 midwives, and a retired mechanic who could read contracts like engines, and we argued clause by clause. We demanded shall. We demanded clear timelines and penalties. We demanded that any marketing attached to the restoration must include the original harm. Marilyn's counsel called me difficult. I called it basic accounting. In the end, they conceded because the summit had taught them that vague generosity is a liability when receipts exist. The signed agreement became public, posted online, and printed on the wall of our community hall. People took selfies with it like it was a celebrity, because in a place where rights had always been whispered, a contract that admitted wrongdoing felt like a monument. Then Marilyn tried to change the narrative anyway. They funded a glossy campaign called Roots of Hope, featuring drone footage of our Delta at golden hour and voiceovers about partnership. The first cut didn't mention bulldozers or high heels or the corridor that had never been completed. It made the harm vanish into a vague challenge. When the campaign premiered on a streaming channel, my phone lit up with messages from villagers who felt their history being repackaged as a marketing mood. I didn't rage publicly. I sent Marilyn a formal notice citing the contract's disclosure requirement and attached a time-stamped clip of the omission. 3 hours later, the video disappeared and returned with a new 15-second segment acknowledging the clearing and naming Longleaf Delta. It wasn't perfect, but it was proof that language can be forced to carry truth if you tie it down with consequences. The next tactic was quieter. They tried to weaponize my blood tie to pressure me into joining their internal governance. Mr. Vale visited the Delta with a box of imported tea and a smile that smelled like strategy. "Mr. Marilyn believes your presence could improve trust," he said, gesturing toward the new mangrove nursery, as if it were a prop in his pitch. "A board seat would give you influence." I stared at him. "Influence over what?" I asked. "Over how they describe what they did?" Mr. Vale's smile tightened. "Over future decisions?" he insisted. "You could ensure nothing like this happens again." I pointed at the ledger case in the restoration center. "That's how we ensure it," I said. "We count. We publish. We organize. Your board seat is a chair made of obligation." Mr. Vale tried a different angle. "Think about legacy," he said. "Think about your mother. She would want you secure." The mention of my mother was a cheap hook. I let silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. "My mother wanted the Delta secure," I said. "Not me." Mr. Vale left without finishing his tea. A month after the trust was funded, our cooperative's bank flagged a suspicious transfer attempt. Someone had filed documents claiming to be an authorized signatory, requesting a temporary reallocation of funds to a Marilyn-affiliated contractor for expedited work. The paperwork looked professional, stamped, signed, and entirely false. If the bank clerk hadn't recognized my name from the summit, the money might have slipped out like water through a crack. We traced the filing to a shell consultancy registered in Harbor City under a name that sounded like a poem, Azure Renewal. When we looked deeper, we found the same legal agent who had filed several Marilyn corridor permits years earlier. Adrian had promised payment, and now someone inside his machine was trying to pull it back by bureaucracy. That was when I understood that victory is not a moment. It is a maintenance schedule. We didn't call the police first. Police can be slow. Banks can be faster when embarrassed. We called journalists. An investigative reporter named Sashi Rao, who had been in the summit audience, published an article titled, "When Restoration Funds Get Raided by Paperwork." The story spread, because people love a second scandal more than they love a first. The bank froze the account for 24 hours, then reopened it with new protections, including multi-person verification by cooperative members and external auditors. Marilyn issued a statement blaming a rogue vendor. The statement might have worked if Sashi hadn't already posted the vendor's registration links showing a Marilyn executive's signature. Adrian called me that night. It was the first time he had spoken to me without an intermediary. His voice was controlled, low. "I didn't authorize this," he said. I believed him. Not because he was good, but because he hated losing control. "Then you have a leak in your house," I said. "Fix it. Or I'll keep the lights on you until your shareholders start asking why their repair looks like theft." He inhaled sharply, anger and calculation colliding. "You are not easy," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm expensive now." After the attempted raid, Our cooperative built what we called the Salt Ledger Wall, a public dashboard in the restoration center showing every incoming and outgoing transaction, every contractor bid, every planted seedling count, every water quality reading, updated weekly. Teenagers volunteered to manage it, learning spreadsheets like they were learning a new kind of fishing. Tourists came and asked why we displayed our finances so openly. Old Bin answered them in his gravel voice. Because secrecy is how we got hurt. The wall didn't just protect money, it rebuilt trust inside our own community, because even good people can be tempted when large sums arrive. Transparency made temptation heavier. It made us accountable to each other, not to Marilyn's PR. In Harbor City, the fallout kept mutating. Leora's disappearance became gossip fuel. Some said she'd been sent to a Swiss clinic. Others said she'd fled to a private island. When a blurry photo surfaced online of her at an airport, wearing sunglasses and looking thin, commenters argued whether she was a villain or a victim. I didn't participate. My feelings about her didn't matter as much as the system that had trained her to treat theft as performance. Still, one rainy evening, a message arrived from an unknown number. "It's Leora. I need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time. Puddle rested his head on my knee, warm and solid. Finally, I replied, "If you come alone. No cameras, no lawyers." She answered, "Okay." She arrived 2 nights later at the Delta Ferry dock wearing a plain hoodie. No pearls, no entourage. She looked smaller without her stage lighting, and for the first time I saw her as a person rather than a character. She followed me to the mangrove nursery where our seedlings sat in neat rows, their leaves trembling in humid wind. Leora stared at them as if they were a language she didn't speak. "I didn't know," she said quietly. The sentence annoyed me, because not knowing is a privilege. "You could have known," I replied. "You chose not to." Her eyes filled, but the tears seemed less rehearsed. "They taught me that everything is negotiable," she whispered. "That if people are angry, you perform remorse and they soften." She swallowed. "When you played the recording, it felt like the floor disappeared. I hated you. Then I realized I hated that you saw me clearly." She looked down. "I can't undo what I did, but I can tell you something you don't know. The corridor permits. My mother pushed them through, not just for charity tours. There was a private deal with Skyline Logistics to reroute shipping. The Marsh clearing was part of it." My stomach tightened. "Do you have proof?" I asked. Leora hesitated, then pulled a small memory card from her pocket. "I copied files before they sent me away," she said. "I thought I might need leverage. I hate that I learned leverage, but I have it." We met Sashi Rao the next day at the restoration center. Leora handed over the card, hands trembling. The files contained internal emails, permit drafts, and a map that showed the flood corridor had been designed not for safety, but for a private logistics lane that benefited Marilyn's shipping partner. The emails included Vivian's name repeatedly. So Vivian hadn't just been a pearl-wearing actress. She had been a broker of harm. Sashi's eyes shone with the feral joy reporters get when a story grows teeth. "This is enormous," she said. Leora flinched. "Will you publish my name?" she asked. Sashi considered. "If you want protection, anonymity helps until it doesn't," she said. I looked at Leora. "This isn't about protecting you," I said. "It's about protecting the Delta from another safety project that's really a profit tunnel." Leora nodded, jaw tight. "Publish it," she said. "I'm tired of being saved by lies." When the second scandal hit, Vivian's social circle turned on her the way wealthy circles do. Not because they discovered morality, but because she had become inconvenient. Adrian filed for separation in a statement that framed him as betrayed. I didn't buy it. He might not have authorized every detail, but he had benefited from the machine. Still, the pressure forced action. The state reopened the corridor investigation, and permits across the coastal region were audited. Other villages started contacting me, asking how to build their own ledgers, how to model loss, how to make numbers loud. I told them the truth. The work is boring and relentless. You take photos. You collect receipts. You don't let anyone rewrite your suffering as an inspirational montage without the ugly parts. Some people thanked me. Some resented me for making them confront their own compromises. Either way, the ledger spread like a method, which was better than spreading like a myth. The academy tried to erase me from their brochure, but students remembered. A group started a club called Fix, What We Break, using my old canvas bag slogan like a banner. They invited me to speak at graduation, expecting a triumphant speech. I declined and sent a short video instead, recorded in the mangrove nursery with mud on my boots. I said, "If you want to help, stop treating communities like content. Ask what was broken. Ask who benefits. And if your help needs applause, it's probably not help." The video circulated anyway, shared by teenagers who were beginning to suspect their shiny education was designed to keep them comfortable, not courageous. That shift mattered more than my individual story. You can't restore a coastline without changing how people think about who deserves protection. One afternoon, months later, I found Mr. Vale waiting at the restoration center, staring at the salt ledger wall. He looked older, his polite angles softened by fatigue. "You've built something impressive," he said. I didn't thank him. "Why are you here?" I asked. He sighed. "To return something," he said, and held out a thin envelope. Inside was my mother's birth record, corrected, with a note indicating the original discrepancy had been flagged years ago and then resolved by an internal Marilyn committee. Mr. Vale's voice dropped. "They knew you existed," he admitted. "They chose not to bring you in because it complicated inheritance optics. I was a junior associate then. I signed the memo. I've regretted it." He looked at my grandfather's ledger in the display case. "You count everything," he said softly. "So count this too. I'm sorry." I studied his face. I couldn't tell if his regret was moral or simply exhaustion from a collapsing narrative. Maybe both. "Apologies are cheap," I said. "If you want to pay, testify." Mr. Vale swallowed. "I will," he said. It was the first time I heard him speak without a smile. He testified 6 weeks later at a state hearing, admitting under oath that Marilyn's committee had suppressed records to control succession and minimize scandal risk. The committee's minutes became evidence, and suddenly my existence wasn't just a personal drama. It was a corporate governance failure. Regulators imposed penalties. Shareholders sued. Adrian's empire didn't fall, but it bent, forced to install independent monitors and publish compliance reports. It was not poetic justice. It was administrative justice, which is the kind that actually changes budgets. Old Ben listened to the hearing on a borrowed radio, volume turned high for his fading ears, and when the verdict came down, he didn't cheer. He simply wrote a new entry in his ledger. "System costs recovered, partial." Then he looked at me and said, "We keep counting." By the time the next monsoon season arrived, the delta held better. Our new oyster reefs reduced surge. Our mangrove roots caught silt. Floodwater still came, because nature doesn't care about courtroom winds, but it receded faster, less destructive. In the aftermath, volunteers from Harbor City arrived to help students, office workers, even a few people who confessed they had once liked Leora's curated kindness online. They shoveled mud, repaired boards, and listened to elders tell stories about the marsh before it was cut. Listening, I realized, was its own form of repayment when it led to action. Puddle trotted among them, collecting scratches and shrimp treats like a diplomat. At dusk, I walked the new boardwalk and watched the nursery lights glow softly. The ledger wall inside the center displayed our numbers in plain text. No poetry. It wasn't romantic. It was real. And that, in the end, was the point. To move from a world where a single phone call could erase a village to a world where erasure triggers an invoice the powerful can't ignore because the community has learned to keep the books together. On the anniversary of the summit, I climbed the hill above our restored nursery with Puddle bounding ahead, tail like a flag. The river below shimmered. Wind carried the scent of wet earth and young leaves. Old Ben came up behind me, slower now, but still stubborn. He handed me an orange, one of the first from a new grove we'd planted. Not as a tourist orchard, but as an income stream for families who had lost years to the clearing. I peeled it, and the scent burst bright and clean. "So," my grandfather said, "was it worth it?" I thought of the marble hall, the velvet sofa, the rules Mr. Vale recited as if he could script my life. I thought of Leora's oath on stage, of the way a single word swear had opened a door for truth. I thought of the money, yes, but more than money. The feeling of watching powerful people realize they could not erase a marsh with one phone call anymore, not without being counted. I bit into the orange and tasted sunlight stored in pulp. "It was worth it," I said. Puddle barked twice, as if agreeing. Below us, the delta held on, roots gripping mud, the slow work of repair continuing long after headlines moved on. That was the real victory. Not revenge, not inheritance, not becoming a Marilyn. but proving that a village ledger could outweigh a corporation's silence if you carried it into the light and refused to apologize for the wait.